You might remember Canfield bikes from way back in the heyday when the Canfield brothers were hucking off of big Utah sandstone cliffs. This is the Jedi, and it's their 29-inch wheeled downhill race bike with a focus on going fast through the rough stuff. The frame is all aluminum, has no adjustments, and is a full 29er only. So the Jedi uses Canfield's Formula 1 dual-link suspension layout that also employs an idler pulley because the rear wheel grows so much through the 203 mils of rear wheel travel. Okay, so taking a closer look at the geometry, we chose the large size, which has a reach of 475 mils. Now the reason we went with a large is because of the wheelbase. On paper, it stands at 1279 millimeters, so that falls in line with the rest of the downhill bikes that we tested. When I first jumped on the Jedi, there were quite a few things that stood out to me that were very different about this bike. The first was just how plush this bike was. I referenced their suspension setup guide and ended up going with the firmest for my weight setting. That ended up being a 388 pound spring. The second was the steering. This Öhlins fork uses a 54 millimeter offset crown. Even with the 62.5 degree head angle, the bike did feel a little twitchy in the turns. The third thing was the ultra high gearing, and that's due to the widely spaced E13 hub. Now that in theory gives you a stronger wheel, but even pedaling to and from the chairlift was a little bit more of a task due to the overall weight of the bike and just how hard the gear was. Once I got the Jedi set up to my preferences and got a little bit more familiar with its habits, blasting laps on this bike was a treat because it is so comfortable. It's pretty mind-blowing how smooth this bike is in the rough stuff. And that's a combination of that superb Öhlins shock and the rearward axle path. And that just eliminates huge square edge braking bumps and keeps the wheel locked to the ground. So what's it like to jump the Jedi then? Well, that rearward axle path really does eat up the bumps, but it does change the balance point of where you're positioned on the bike between the wheels. So it's not quite as natural as something like the Nuke Proof, which has a single pivot and a smaller rear wheel. Landing some of those bigger hits on the Jedi posed a couple issues where, one, there was a little bit of seat buzz, and two, some of the bottom outs were quite harsh. I felt like I could use a little bit more progression there to counteract that problem. We talked a little bit about the suspension details and their inputs to the bike, but let's get a greater overlook of the specifications with the other components on the Jedi. Another standout component next to the Öhlins suspension has to be the TRP brakes. They're a very light action brake and have tons of power and didn't fade whatsoever, even when our filmers were using the bike to get around the bike park. Another neat component on the bike are Canfield's own cranks. Now this one was spec'd with 165 mil length, but they go all the way down to a 150 mil if you want to run really low sag and an ultra plush suspension setup to keep the cranks off the ground. Let's pick out some of the details on the Jedi that could use some improvement. First and foremost is the fork crown offset. Now that's an easy change, but something a little bit slower would take that heavier, twitchy feeling out of the steering and give you something a little bit more relaxed and controlled. While the Jedi is an ultra smooth bike through the bumps, it's not the quietest bike, and that's due to the limited rubber around the seat stay and chain stay. A little bit more refinement or some homemade additions here with some mastic tape could really improve the silence and smoothness of the Jedi. All right, so what's the overall verdict of the Jedi and who is it really for? Well, it's a bike that really likes to stay up to speed and can truck through the roughest conditions out there. The full 29-inch wheel really gives you a lot of traction, both braking and cornering, but it requires a little bit more of a stronger rider to power it through the corners and get it off the ground. It's also a really burly bike with a stiff aluminum frame and large pivot bearings. That in combination with the external cable routing and easy to swap shock make it the perfect bike for someone who's looking to ride more and work on their bike less. There you have it. There's our verdict on the buttery smooth bomber-built Canfield Jedi. Keep an eye out for the other videos coming from the downhill bike field test.